Clara Simmons had learned a long time ago that some days were harder than others, but she never let that show on her face. She was 31 years old, a single mother to a 7-year-old boy named Danny, and she worked 6 shifts a week at Hargrove Manor, a luxury event venue in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. The venue hosted weddings, charity galas, and private celebrations for the city's wealthiest families. Clara was one of 12 waitstaff members, and she moved through those grand halls with quiet efficiency, a tray balanced on one hand and a polite smile fixed on her face no matter what kind of night it was. That particular Saturday in October was supposed to be a routine shift. The Hargrove family was hosting a private birthday celebration for Edward Hargrove, the patriarch and founder of a real estate empire that had shaped half the skyline of the city. He was turning 70, and his son, Richard Hargrove, had organized the entire event. Richard was 45, well-dressed in the way that money makes effortless, and he had a reputation among the staff for being difficult. Not outwardly cruel, but the kind of man who enjoyed small displays of power. He gave orders the way some people breathed, naturally and without thought for anyone on the receiving end. The guest list included around 80 people, all of them from the same world of old money and new influence. There were local politicians, business partners, a few minor celebrities who had grown up in the same social circles, and various family members who arrived in expensive cars and spoke in the low, confident tones of people who had never once doubted their place in a room. Clara and the rest of the staff had been briefed that morning about expectations. Everything had to be perfect. No mistakes, no delays, no visible stress from anyone wearing a uniform. Clara wore her standard black apron over a white collared shirt, her dark hair pulled back neatly. She was not the kind of person who stood out in a room, and she preferred it that way. Her job was to disappear into the background, to refill glasses and clear plates, and respond to requests with nothing more than a nod and a yes. She was good at it. She had been doing it for 4 years at that venue, and another 3 before that at a hotel downtown. What none of the guests knew, and what even most of her coworkers had forgotten, was that Clara had once been something entirely different. Before Danny was born, before her marriage fell apart, before the series of quiet catastrophes that had redirected her life, Clara had studied classical piano for 17 years. She had trained under a conservatory instructor in Virginia, performed in recitals and small concerts, and at 22, had won a regional competition that briefly made her believe a professional life in music was possible. Then life happened, the way it does, and the piano became something she only touched when she visited her mother's house on holidays. There was a grand piano positioned near the far wall of the main hall, a polished black Steinway that had been rented as part of the decor. A professional pianist had been hired to play background music during the cocktail hour, but somewhere between the afternoon soundcheck and the start of the event, he had called in sick. The venue manager had scrambled to find a replacement but came up empty. By the time the guests began arriving, the piano sat untouched, and the event coordinator had resorted to a playlist through the speaker system, which felt noticeably less elegant, and which Richard Hargrove had already complained about twice before the first hour was finished. It was during a brief lull in service that Richard approached Clara near the side corridor. She had just set down an empty tray and was about to return to the kitchen when he stopped her with a look that expected compliance before he had even spoken. He told her that one of the other staff members had mentioned she could play piano. He did not ask if it was true. He stated it as a fact that now belonged to him. He told her he wanted her to play for the remainder of the cocktail hour, roughly 40 minutes, and that it would make his father's evening considerably better. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. She told him, politely and without raising her voice, that she was there to serve the event, not to perform, and that it had been many years since she had played seriously. Richard looked at her the way certain men look at people they consider beneath them when those people say no. He smiled, but it was not a warm smile. He told her it was not a request, that she was an employee of the venue for the evening and he was the client, and that he expected her to do what he was asking without making it into a bigger issue than it needed to be. A few guests nearby had already begun to notice the exchange. Some turned their heads with casual curiosity. Others watched more openly, and there was something in the air that Clara recognized immediately. That specific kind of anticipation that forms in a crowd when they expect someone to fail publicly. She could see it in the slight smiles, the exchanged glances, the way a small cluster of women near the bar had gone quiet and turned their attention fully in her direction. They assumed she would sit down and stumble through something embarrassing. They assumed this would be entertaining. Clara looked at the piano across the room. She looked at Richard Hargrove. She smoothed the front of her apron, took a steady breath, and walked toward the bench without another word. The room did not go quiet when Clara sat down at the Steinway. People were still talking, still laughing, still moving between the bar and the small clusters of conversation that form at events like this one. A few guests glanced over with mild curiosity when they noticed the waitress settling onto the piano bench, but most returned almost immediately to their own conversations. The general assumption was clear without anyone needing to say it out loud. This would be background noise at best and a minor embarrassment at worst, something to smile about later over dessert.
That's it.
Richard Hargrove had already moved away. He was back near his father's table, leaning in to speak with someone, satisfied that he had handled the situation the way he handled most small inconveniences, by directing it toward the nearest available person. He did not watch Clara sit down. He did not think it required watching. Clara placed both hands in her lap for a moment. She looked at the keys without touching them. Anyone watching closely might have noticed something shift in her expression, not nervousness, but something closer to the feeling of returning to a place you had not visited in a long time. The keys were familiar in the way that certain things stay in the body even after the mind has moved on. 17 years of lessons do not disappear. They settle into the hands, into the posture, into the way a person positions themselves before a first note is struck. She chose Chopin, specifically the Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. It was one of the first serious pieces she had ever memorized as a young girl, and it was also one of the most quietly devastating pieces ever written for solo piano. It does not announce itself. It does not begin with drama. It opens with something so gentle and so assured that a room full of distracted people does not immediately register that something extraordinary is happening. It simply begins, and then, a few measures in, it becomes impossible to ignore. The first notes came out cleanly. Clara's right hand moved through the opening melody with a steadiness that surprised even her. There was a brief moment of internal adjustment, the kind that happens when a skill long unused reconnects with the body that carries it, and then she was simply playing, not performing in the self-conscious way of someone trying to prove a point, but playing the way she had played as a teenager in her instructor's studio on rainy afternoons in Virginia, when there was nothing in the world except the music and what it asked of her. The first person to stop talking was a woman standing about 10 feet from the piano. She was mid-sentence when the melody reached her, and she paused, turned her head slightly, then turned it fully. She did not say anything to the person beside her. She just listened. Within 30 seconds, the people nearest to the piano had gone noticeably quieter. Within a minute, a perceptible stillness had begun to spread outward from the instrument like something moving through water. One of the older gentlemen near the center of the room set his glass down on a nearby table and folded his hands in front of him. A younger couple near the window stopped their conversation mid-exchange and turned toward the sound without quite meaning to. A woman who had been checking her phone slipped it into her clutch. None of these were grand gestures. They were small, involuntary movements, the kind that happen when something real enters a room that has been full of noise and surface and pretense. Clara did not look up. Her eyes stayed slightly downward, following the keys more from habit than necessity. Her posture was straight but not rigid. She played through the first full section of the nocturne with a control that spoke of deep familiarity. And when the melody began its ornamented return, her right hand moved through the filigree passages with a lightness that seemed almost effortless to anyone watching, though anyone who had ever attempted that piece knew it was not effortless at all. By the time she reached the midpoint of the piece, the cocktail hour had effectively paused. Not completely, not formally, but the quality of the room had changed in the way rooms change when something unexpected demands attention. Conversations had not ended so much as dissolved. People were standing still in a way they had not been standing still 5 minutes before. Even the bartender had stopped moving and was looking toward the piano with an expression that was difficult to name. Edward Hargrove, the birthday man himself, a tall and white-haired man in a dark navy suit who had been holding court at his table since the evening began, had turned his chair slightly so that he faced the piano directly. His expression was open in the unguarded way of someone genuinely moved. He had been to enough events in his 70 years to recognize the difference between entertainment and something that deserved a different word entirely. Richard Hargrove noticed his father's expression first. He followed his father's gaze to the piano, to the woman in the black apron and white collared shirt who was producing something that had no business coming from a person he had spoken to like a minor inconvenience 20 minutes earlier. Something moved across his face that he did not fully control, a flicker of confusion, then something more complicated than that. The guests who had quietly expected humiliation were no longer expecting anything. They were simply there, held in place by something they had not anticipated, standing in a rented hall on a Saturday evening in October, listening to a waitress play Chopin as though she had been born to do exactly that and nothing else. Clara played on, unhurried and unself-conscious, as though the room and everyone in it had ceased to matter in any conventional sense. The nocturne ended the way it always ends, not with a crash or a flourish, but with something that fades so gently that the silence afterward feels like part of the music itself. Clara lifted her hands from the keys and placed them back in her lap. For a moment, nobody moved. The room held that rare and fragile stillness that only exists in the seconds after something beautiful has finished, when people are not yet ready to return to ordinary life and do not quite know what to do with what they have just felt. Then someone started clapping. It was one of the older women near the center of the room, a silver-haired guest in a deep green dress who had been standing completely still for the last several minutes. Her applause was not the polite, rhythmic kind that fills a room out of obligation. It was immediate and genuine, the kind that comes from the hands before the mind has decided to act. Others followed within seconds, and within half a minute the entire room was applauding, some people more enthusiastically than others, but all of them participating in something that felt involuntary, like a collective exhale. Clara turned on the bench and looked at the room for the first time since she had sat down. She had not fully registered how complete the silence had become until she saw it reflected in the faces looking back at her. There were 80 people in that hall, and most of them were looking directly at her with expressions that ranged from surprise to something closer to wonder. She felt her face warm slightly. She was not accustomed to being seen in that room. For 4 years she had worked hard at being invisible, at being efficient and quiet and unremarkable. And in the span of one nocturne, all of that had reversed itself entirely. She stood from the bench and gave a small, understated nod, the kind of acknowledgement that says thank you without making more of the moment than it needs to be. Then she smoothed her apron and stepped away from the piano, because in her mind, she was still a waitress at a birthday party, and there were glasses that needed refilling. She had not taken more than 4 steps when Edward Hargrove rose from his chair. He was a man of obvious physical presence even at 70, broad-shouldered and deliberate in the way he moved, and when he stood the people nearest to him instinctively gave him space. He crossed the floor toward Clara with a directness that made it clear he was not stopping for anyone on the way. She saw him coming and stopped walking, unsure of what was about to happen. He extended his hand to her. She shook it. His grip was firm but not performative. He looked at her with the steady, evaluating gaze of a man who had spent a lifetime reading people in rooms and had learned to tell the difference between competence and genuine ability. He told her that was the finest thing he had heard in that hall in the 20 years his family had been hosting events there. He said it without embellishment, the way people speak when they mean something precisely and do not feel the need to decorate it.
That's it.
Clara thanked him. She meant it simply, without false modesty or unnecessary elaboration. He asked her name and she told him. He repeated it once, as though filing it somewhere useful, and then asked her where she had trained. When she told him about the conservatory in Virginia and the 17 years of study, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition, the look of a person recalibrating an assumption they had made without realizing they had made it. Other guests began to drift toward her in the natural way that people move toward the center of a room's energy. Several of them introduced themselves. A woman who turned out to be a retired music professor shook Clara's hand and spoke to her with the specific warmth that passes between people who share a deep familiarity with the same art form. She mentioned the ornamentation in the second section of the nocturne and said that the control in Clara's right hand was something that could not be faked or hurried, that it took years to earn and most people never fully managed it. Clara received the compliment carefully, the way she received most things, with gratitude and without letting it run away from her. Richard Hargrove appeared at the edge of this small gathering. He stood there for a moment watching his father speak warmly with a woman he had spoken to like a minor inconvenience less than an hour earlier. His expression was difficult to interpret with precision, but there was something in it that resembled discomfort, not guilt exactly, but the particular unease that comes when a person's assumptions about someone have been publicly and completely dismantled. He stepped forward and said something to Clara that he framed as a compliment, telling her she had done a wonderful job and that she had genuinely surprised everyone in the room. Clara looked at him evenly. She thanked him in the same tone she had used all evening, polite and measured, and without any trace of the satisfaction she might reasonably have been feeling. She did not remind him that he had not asked her. She did not reference the way he had smiled when she hesitated, or the guests who had been waiting for her to fail. There was nothing in her manner that sought to extend the moment at his expense. That was not the kind of person she was, and no amount of justification would have made it feel right to her. She excused herself a few minutes later and returned to work, lifting a tray from the side table and moving back through the room with the same quiet efficiency she had carried in with her that morning. The rest of the evening passed the way good evenings do when something unexpected has shifted the atmosphere of a room. The guests were warmer with each other, the conversations easier, the laughter more genuine. Something about witnessing a moment of real and unannounced talent had loosened people in a way that expensive catering and a carefully curated guest list never quite manages on its own. Clara moved through it all the same way she always did, clearing plates and refilling glasses and responding to requests with a nod and a quiet yes, as though the last hour had not happened at all. But it had happened, and the people in that room were not going to forget it easily. Near the end of the evening, as guests began making their way toward the exit in the slow and reluctant way of people who have genuinely enjoyed themselves, Edward Hargrove sought Clara out one more time. She was near the side corridor collecting empty flutes from a tray stand when he approached. He was holding a small card between two fingers, and he offered it to her with the directness that seemed to characterize everything he did. He told her the card belonged to a colleague of his, a woman named Patricia Ellsworth, who sat on the board of the Charleston Arts Foundation, and who also happened to manage a network of private concert series hosted in venues across the state. He said he had already spoken to Patricia briefly before she left for the evening, and that Patricia had asked him to pass the card along personally. Clara took the card and looked at it. She did not say anything for a moment. Edward told her that Patricia hosted 6 private concerts per year, each one featuring a solo performer, and that the compensation was meaningful enough to matter. He said the word meaningful without elaboration, and with enough steadiness that Clara understood he was not speaking loosely. He told her he had no interest in pressuring her into anything, and that the decision was entirely her own, but that in his opinion, it would be a waste of something rare if she spent the rest of her life making sure other people's glasses stayed full. Clara held the card in both hands. She thought about Danny at home with her neighbor watching over him, probably already asleep with one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress the way he always slept. She thought about the piano at her mother's house, the one she sat down at maybe twice a year, and played for 20 minutes before some practical reason pulled her away. She thought about the conservatory studio in Virginia, and the afternoon light that came through the tall windows while her instructor sat in the corner chair and listened without speaking. She thought about all the years between that room and this one, and the specific kind of grief that comes not from losing something, but from setting it down so carefully and so gradually that you almost convince yourself you chose to. She thanked Edward Hargrove. She meant it in a way that went beyond the moment, in a way that had nothing to do with the party or the piano or the applause. He nodded once and wished her a good night and walked back toward his family with the unhurried ease of a man who knew when a conversation had said everything it needed to say. Clara slipped the card into the small pocket of her apron and finished her shift. She did not call Patricia Ellsworth the next day or the day after that. She was not a person who moved quickly toward things that felt large, and this felt large in a way she needed to sit with before she could approach it honestly. She picked Danny up from school that Monday and made dinner, and helped him with his reading, and listened to him talk about a disagreement he had with a boy in his class with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to matters of justice. She put him to bed and then sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the card in front of her and a cup of tea that went cold before she touched it. On Wednesday evening she called the number. Patricia Ellsworth answered on the 3rd ring and spoke with the warm efficiency of someone who had been expecting the call, but had not wanted to apply pressure by saying so. They spoke for nearly an hour. Patricia asked her about her training, her repertoire, how long it had been since she had performed seriously, and whether she had access to an instrument for practice. Clara answered each question honestly, including the parts that were not flattering, including the years away and the rust she knew she would need to work through before she was ready to stand in front of an audience and mean it. Patricia told her that the next available slot in the concert series was 4 months away, which was enough time to prepare properly if Clara was willing to commit to it. She told her the compensation for a single performance would be more than Clara typically earned in 6 weeks of weekend shifts. She said none of this as a manipulation, but as information, offered plainly so that Clara could make a clear decision. Clara said yes before the sentence was fully finished. She did not quit her job the next morning. She was practical enough to understand that one phone call did